May 10, 1940. Just before dawn, the quiet streets outside Haarlem were awakened by an unfamiliar sound. Not church bells, not bicycle wheels, aircraft, hundreds of them. Within minutes, explosions echoed across the Dutch countryside as German paratroopers descended from the sky and armored columns crossed the border. The Netherlands, a country that had hoped neutrality would spare it from another European war, was suddenly under attack. Inside a modest apartment, a 14-year-old girl stood beside the window, watching frightened neighbors run into the streets. Her name was Freddie Oversteegen. She had no idea that within a few years, German officers across occupied Holland would unknowingly fear one of the most ordinary sights imaginable. A teenage girl, riding a bicycle. To understand how that happened, you first have to understand the family that raised her. Freddie's childhood had never been easy. She and her older sister, Truus Oversteegen, grew up in poverty. Their parents separated while they were still young. Money was almost non-existent. The mattresses they slept on were stuffed with straw. But despite having almost nothing, their mother, Treintje Oversteegen, believed there was always room for someone who needed help. Long before the German occupation, Jewish refugees escaping persecution crossed their doorstep. Political activists fleeing violence slept under their roof. Sometimes Freddie didn't even know the names of the people sharing their home. Her mother explained only one thing: if someone needs help, you make room, even if that meant sacrificing your own comfort. It was a lesson Freddie absorbed long before she understood its true cost. Then came the invasion. The Dutch army resisted for only a few days. Against the overwhelming strength of the Wehrmacht, defeat became unavoidable. The occupation began almost immediately. German soldiers patrolled the streets. Nazi banners replaced Dutch flags. Curfews appeared. Restrictions multiplied. Neighbors began disappearing. Years later, Freddie remembered one sound more clearly than any other: the pounding. German soldiers smashing rifle butts against front doors in the middle of the night, the shouting, the crying. Families dragged into the street. Children screaming for parents. Sometimes, no one returned. The message became painfully clear. Fear was now part of everyday life. Most people tried to survive quietly. The Oversteegen family chose something else: resistance. At first, it seemed almost harmless. Freddie and Truus helped distribute illegal newspapers. They carried anti-Nazi pamphlets beneath their coats. Late at night, they cycled through dark streets carrying buckets of glue and rolled up posters. When they found German propaganda pasted across public buildings, they covered it. One message read, "The Netherlands must be free." Another warned Dutch workers not to travel to Germany. Every leaflet represented an act of defiance. If they were caught, execution was a real possibility. But there was one advantage. Who would suspect two teenage girls riding bicycles? The occupation had underestimated them before it even began. Their activities soon attracted attention. Not from the Germans, from the resistance. One afternoon in 1941, a man knocked on their apartment door. His name was Frans van der Wiel, a local resistance organizer. He had heard stories. The woman hiding refugees. The daughters spreading underground newspapers. He asked their mother a simple question: "Can your daughters help us?" She answered without hesitation: "Yes." Freddie looked toward her sister. Neither of them hesitated. They also said yes. But van der Wiel wasn't ready to trust them. Not yet. Anyone could claim to oppose the Nazis. Very few remained silent under pressure. So he devised a test. Several days later, he returned. This time wearing the uniform of the Gestapo, he burst into the apartment shouting in German, pistol drawn, demanding to know where Jews were hiding. The room exploded into chaos. Freddie didn't cry. She didn't freeze. Instead, she attacked him. She kicked, hit, scratched. Anything to stop the man she believed had come to arrest innocent people. Truus joined her. Neither sister revealed a single name. Neither begged for mercy. Only after several tense moments did the stranger lower his weapon. Then, he smiled. The Gestapo officer disappeared. The resistance commander returned. You passed. Only then did he explain what joining the resistance truly meant. You'll learn sabotage. You'll destroy railways. You'll burn German supplies. Then he paused. And eventually, you may have to kill. The apartment fell silent. Freddie looked at her sister. Then, according to the source material, she smiled and replied, "Well, I've never done that before." It sounded almost childish, which made it all the more unsettling. She was 14 years old. Before they left home, their mother gave them one final piece of advice. Not about weapons, not about escaping capture, not about survival. Instead, she simply said, "Always stay human." Neither sister fully understood what those words would mean. Not yet. Their training took place beneath the ground. Literally. Hidden beneath what appeared to be an ordinary potato storage shed, members of the Dutch resistance had built a concealed meeting place. There, Freddie held a pistol for the first time. She learned how to load it, how to clear a malfunction, how to breathe before squeezing the trigger, how to fire without panicking. The instructors weren't trying to turn teenagers into soldiers. They were trying to keep them alive. Because mistakes inside occupied Holland rarely offered second chances. Their first assignments involved sabotage rather than assassination. German supply warehouses had become valuable targets. Destroying them could delay troop movements and cripple logistics. The problem was obvious. SS guards protected every entrance. A direct assault would fail. The resistance needed a distraction. That distraction was two teenage girls. Freddie and Truus approached the guards as if they were simply curious local girls. They laughed, smiled, asked harmless questions. One even complimented a soldier's uniform. The guards relaxed. Behind them, resistance fighters slipped into the warehouse unnoticed. Minutes later, flames erupted into the night sky. By the time the Germans understood what had happened, the girls were already pedaling away as if nothing had happened. Van der Weel watched carefully. He realized something most commanders hadn't. These sisters possessed a weapon impossible to manufacture. People underestimated them. That made them extraordinarily dangerous. Soon, the missions became darker. The resistance had identified a Dutch collaborator, not a German officer, not an SS commander, a Dutch woman. According to resistance intelligence, she had compiled a detailed list containing the names and addresses of Jewish families living throughout the region. If delivered to the Nazis, hundreds of innocent people would likely disappear. The assignment went to Freddie, 14 years old. Alone, she rode through Haarlem exactly as she always did. One bicycle. Braided hair. An ordinary teenager. She found the woman sitting alone on a park bench. Freddie walked over casually, smiled politely, then asked one simple question. "What's your name?" The woman answered. Freddie now knew she had the correct target. She slowly reached beneath her coat, pulled out a pistol, looked directly into the woman's eyes, and fired. Then, she climbed back onto her bicycle and quietly rode away. The resistance had eliminated the list before it reached the Germans. But Freddie would later admit something she never forgot. After pulling the trigger, her first instinct wasn't relief. It wasn't triumph. It was to help the woman she had just shot. That instinct, she said, never completely disappeared, no matter how many missions followed. What Freddie didn't yet know was that this first assassination would only be the beginning. Soon, she and her sister would develop a method so unexpected that dozens of Nazi officers would willingly follow them to their deaths. Late 1942. Occupied Netherlands. By now, the German occupation had settled into a grim routine. Military checkpoints appeared on roads that had once been open to everyone. Food was rationed. Curfews became stricter. Resistance fighters disappeared almost weekly. Some were arrested. Others simply vanished. Rumors spread that prisoners were being taken to concentration camps in Germany. Whether the stories were true hardly mattered anymore. Fear itself had become one of the Nazis' most effective weapons. Yet amid that atmosphere of constant surveillance, one thing remained remarkably ordinary. Bicycles. Thousands of Dutch citizens rode them every day. Workers pedaled to factories. Children cycled to school. Farmers carried supplies in wooden baskets mounted above their wheels. German soldiers stopped paying attention to them, and that, the Dutch resistance realized, could become one of the occupation's greatest weaknesses. By now, Freddie Oversteegen was no longer the inexperienced 14-year-old who had nervously carried underground newspapers. Months of sabotage, courier work, and increasingly dangerous operations had transformed her into one of the youngest active members of the resistance. Her older sister, Truus Oversteegen, had undergone the same transformation. Together, they had already transported illegal weapons, hidden fugitives, and helped sabotage German infrastructure. Then they met someone who would become one of the most famous resistance fighters in Europe. A young law student named Hannie Schaft. Because of her distinctive red hair, she would later become known as the girl with the red hair. Unlike Freddie, Hannie came from a middle-class family and had been studying law before the occupation interrupted her life. The three young women couldn't have looked less threatening. One was barely out of childhood. Another looked like an ordinary university student. The third often appeared no different from thousands of Dutch girls riding bicycles through occupied streets. The Germans rarely saw them as soldiers. That mistake would prove fatal. Resistance leaders soon assigned them a new type of mission. Not sabotage. Not intelligence gathering. Targeted elimination. The purpose wasn't revenge. It was strategy. Certain Nazi officials, collaborators, and members of the occupation administration had become too dangerous to leave alive. Some directed arrests. Others organized deportations. Several personally tortured prisoners after capture. Every one of them represented a continuing threat to hundreds of civilians. Conventional military action wasn't possible. The Dutch resistance had neither the manpower nor the weapons. Instead, they relied on deception. One resistance commander spread a map across a table. Several names had been circled in pencil. Each belonged to a German officer or Dutch collaborator. Each followed predictable routines. Each believed the occupation had become secure. The commander looked toward the three women. They already carry pistols. He paused. But that's not your greatest weapon. No one spoke. He pointed toward the bicycles leaning against the wall. Those are. The plan sounded almost absurd. Freddie or Hannie would deliberately cross paths with a selected officer. Sometimes they smiled. Sometimes they asked for directions. Sometimes they simply rode slowly enough for the man to notice them. The reactions were often depressingly predictable. Many German officers, convinced they belonged to a superior race and occupied a conquered country, assumed young Dutch women posed absolutely no danger. Some flirted openly. Others attempted conversation. A few invited the girls to take a walk through nearby woods or parks. Exactly as the resistance had hoped. The women accepted, but they never intended to return alone. One afternoon, Hannie rode into a small village where intelligence had identified a Dutch collaborator responsible for helping the Gestapo identify resistance safe houses. He recognized her immediately as an attractive young woman. He smiled. She smiled back. For several minutes they spoke casually about nothing of consequence. The weather. The war. the shortage of food. Then Hanny suggested they continue talking somewhere quieter. He eagerly agreed. Neither of them noticed another bicycle quietly following at a distance. Freddie. The path gradually left the village behind. Houses disappeared. Fields gave way to trees. The only sounds were birds and bicycle tires rolling across packed dirt. The collaborator never suspected he had already passed the point where anyone could hear him call for help. When they reached a secluded section of woodland, Hanny stopped. The man assumed she wanted privacy. Instead, he heard another bicycle approaching from behind. He turned. Freddie stepped off her bicycle. A pistol appeared in her hand. The man's expression changed instantly. He finally understood. But understanding came too late. The resistance had carefully selected locations where escape was almost impossible. Moments later, the operation was over. Within minutes, both bicycles disappeared down separate country roads. To anyone who saw them, they looked like two ordinary girls returning home before curfew. Operations like this required extraordinary discipline. The resistance imposed strict rules. Never use the same route twice. Never target the same area repeatedly. Never remain near the scene. Never discuss missions unnecessarily. Most importantly, never allow emotions to influence decisions. Freddie later admitted that this last rule was the hardest. She never celebrated killing. She never described it as exciting. Instead, she often explained that every mission left another permanent scar. The people they targeted had names, faces, voices. Some begged. Others cursed. A few never understood what was happening until the final second. Those memories remained with her long after the war ended. The missions became increasingly successful. German reports began noting an unsettling pattern. Officials disappeared after meeting unidentified young women. Collaborators were found dead near forests and isolated roads. Witnesses occasionally remembered seeing bicycles. Nothing more. The occupation authorities initially dismissed the idea. They searched for armed men, former soldiers, professional assassins. They never imagined teenage girls carried out many of the attacks. That assumption bought the resistance precious time. Meanwhile, Freddie continued performing other assignments. She delivered forged identity documents, escorted Jewish children to hiding places, transported small weapons beneath bags of groceries strapped to her bicycle. Sometimes she carried explosives hidden beneath vegetables. At German checkpoints, soldiers occasionally smiled at the polite teenage girl and waved her through without inspection. One guard even complimented her bicycle. Neither realized that a few pounds of explosives rested only inches away. Freddie later reflected that innocence became camouflage. The Germans saw what they expected to see: a child, not a resistance operative. By 1943, however, German counterintelligence had begun adapting. Security around senior officers increased. Random searches became more frequent. Informants multiplied. Arrests spread throughout resistance networks. Entire cells disappeared within weeks. The danger intensified for everyone, especially Freddie, Truus, and Hanny. The occupation authorities still didn't know their names, but they now understood one terrifying fact. Someone was systematically eliminating carefully selected targets. The hunt had begun, and sooner or later, the hunters would come dangerously close to discovering that the people responsible weren't seasoned commandos, but three young women riding ordinary Dutch bicycles. One betrayal, one mistake, one careless conversation could destroy everything they had built. By early 1944, the German occupation authorities had reached an unsettling conclusion. Someone was systematically eliminating carefully selected officials across occupied Holland. Not random attacks, not emotional acts of revenge. These operations displayed planning, patience, precise intelligence. Victims were chosen carefully. Collaborators disappeared. Members of the Gestapo were ambushed. German officers vanished after leaving cafes, government buildings, or railway stations. Yet despite months of investigation, the occupation forces still searched for experienced commandos. Former soldiers, professional assassins. Almost no one suspected the truth. Many of those operations involved 3 young women who looked like ordinary Dutch civilians riding bicycles through occupied streets. For Freddie Oversteegen, every new assignment became more dangerous than the last. The occupation authorities increased checkpoints. Identity papers were inspected more frequently. German patrols questioned cyclists traveling alone. Resistance safe houses disappeared one after another. Friends stopped returning from missions. Every arrest raised the same terrifying possibility. Would someone talk? Under torture, almost anyone could. That reality haunted every member of the resistance. Not because they doubted one another, because they understood what the Nazis were capable of. Freddie's group adapted constantly. Weapons were hidden in new locations. Meeting places changed almost daily. Messages were memorized instead of written. Sometimes entire operations were canceled simply because one unfamiliar face appeared near a rendezvous point. The resistance survived through caution. One careless habit could destroy months of work. Freddie learned never to ride the same route home, never linger after a mission, never allow strangers to remember her face. To everyone she passed, she remained exactly what the Germans believed they were seeing. Just another teenage girl. One afternoon, intelligence reached the resistance that a senior Dutch collaborator had been compiling fresh information on families suspected of helping Jews escape deportation. If the documents reached German headquarters, dozens of people, including children, would almost certainly be arrested. The resistance debated what to do. Destroy the documents, intercept the courier, or eliminate the man responsible. According to the source material, they chose the last option. The mission again involved deception rather than force. Freddie and Hanny Shaft positioned themselves along the man's usual cycling route. Nothing about them appeared unusual. One carried a small shopping bag. The other adjusted the chain on her bicycle, as if it had slipped. When the collaborator slowed to offer assistance, believing he was helping 2 harmless young women, he unknowingly stepped into a carefully prepared ambush. The operation lasted only moments. By the time nearby villagers heard what sounded like distant gunshots, the resistance fighters had already disappeared along separate roads. The documents never reached German hands. Operations like these created an unexpected psychological effect. German officers became increasingly suspicious of ordinary encounters. A young woman asking for directions, someone waving from the roadside, a cyclist slowing beside them. Simple interactions that had once seemed harmless now carried uncertainty. The occupation depended heavily on confidence. Confidence that officials could travel safely. Confidence that collaborators would continue cooperating. Confidence that resistance activity could be crushed. Every successful operation weakened that confidence, sometimes far more effectively than explosions ever could. As the war entered its final phase, conditions inside the Netherlands became catastrophic. Food shortages worsened dramatically. Entire neighborhoods survived on little more than soup made from tulip bulbs and sugar beets. The winter of 1944-45 would later become known as the Hunger Winter. Freddie continued operating despite constant hunger. Many resistance fighters had lost significant weight. Some missions were carried out after days with almost nothing to eat. Yet they continued, because surrender no longer seemed possible. Too much had already been sacrificed. The danger reached its peak after one resistance member was captured. For several tense days, Freddie, Truce, and Hanny waited to learn whether their identities had been exposed. Every knock on the door could mean arrest. Every passing military truck caused neighbors to look away nervously. The sisters slept in different locations. Sometimes they changed hiding places every night. The source describes this period as one of constant uncertainty, where survival depended as much on caution as courage. Then came devastating news. In March 1945, only weeks before the liberation of the Netherlands, Hannie Schaft was arrested by German authorities during a checkpoint inspection. She carried illegal newspapers and a concealed pistol. This time, there would be no escape. Despite interrogation, she revealed little. On April 17, 1945, she was executed in the dunes near Haarlem. According to witnesses, the first bullet failed to kill her immediately. She reportedly looked at her executioners and said, "I shoot better than you." A second shot ended her life. She was 24 years old. Freddie and Truus would never forget her. Only weeks later, everything changed. German resistance collapsed across Western Europe. Canadian forces entered Dutch cities to cheering crowds. Occupation flags disappeared, for the first time in 5 years. People rode their bicycles without fear of checkpoints or curfews. Freddie was only 19 years old, yet the war had stolen much of her childhood. Like many resistance veterans, she found peace surprisingly difficult. People celebrated liberation. She remembered faces. Friends who never came home. Children hidden from deportation. The men and women she had been forced to kill. Years afterward, interviewers often asked whether she regretted those missions. Her answer remained remarkably consistent. She rejected the idea of calling herself a hero. Heroes, she insisted, were people who survived because others had acted. She believed she had simply done what circumstances demanded. Nothing more. Nothing less. For decades after the war, Freddie rarely spoke publicly about her experiences. Like countless veterans, she carried much of the conflict silently. Only later in life did she begin sharing her memories so younger generations could understand what occupation truly meant. Not abstract history, not dates in textbooks, but ordinary people forced into extraordinary decisions. She often reminded audiences that resistance was rarely glamorous. It involved fear, loneliness, constant uncertainty, and choices no teenager should ever have to make. Historians continue studying the Dutch resistance because of people like Freddie Oversteegen. She demonstrated that resistance did not always depend on military rank or physical strength. Sometimes it depended on invisibility, on patience, on understanding how an enemy thinks. The Nazis expected armed men hiding in forests. They rarely expected a 14-year-old girl pedaling quietly through town. That assumption became one of their greatest blind spots, and the resistance used it relentlessly. The bicycle itself, of course, was only a tool. Its true power came from something far more dangerous: the willingness of ordinary people to risk everything when freedom disappeared. Freddie Oversteegen never possessed tanks. She never commanded an army. She never wore a general's uniform. She carried messages, transported weapons, helped hide the persecuted, and when circumstances demanded it, she rode toward danger instead of away from it. By the end of the war, the teenage girl the Nazis had dismissed as harmless had become one of the most remarkable young resistance fighters in occupied Europe. Her greatest weapon was never the pistol hidden beneath her coat. It was the fact that an empire built on fear never imagined that courage could arrive on 2 bicycle wheels.